China, again, a big topic. Deloitte Access Economics partner Chris Richardson this morning saying that China trade aggression will provide a multi-billion-dollar boost to the government's bottom line. He's calling it smart politics but dumb economics. Peter, is he right?
Danica, I think it's right to say that the relationship is so important that any effort made diplomatically in respect to our government doing everything they can to repair the relationship is absolutely critical because of the importance of the relationship to our exporters, to our industry and so on. Of course, we have to stand up to our values, That goes without saying, and I think there's strong bipartisan support for that. I've been critical of the government in the past for mismanaging the relationship, being a bit all over the place on it. But there is now a really critical period that we're facing over the next decade, frankly, where governments, Australian governments of whatever political stripe, have to get this right and manage this to make sure that they maximise Australia's national interest. And we still haven't seen a plan from Scott Morrison to support our exporters, to save Australian jobs, diversify our economy, and of course, who's going to suffer the most? Australian jobs are on the line. People are going to lose their jobs who work in the export space. So there's a huge challenge ahead of us, and they need to get this right.
Is it a case, though, that Australia needs China more than China needs us? We look at iron ore, it's at record highs. It's one of our bulk exports to China. Trent, I guess China needs our iron ore right now.
It does, because we have some of the best quality and most competitive iron ore in the world, and I don't think China could easily replace Australia as a source for what's obviously an essential ingredient into their own economic advancement. But it comes to the broader point. Australia does want a close economic relationship with China. We recognise the mutual benefits of that relationship. But we need that to be on a mutually respectful terms as well, which is, I think, what's been missing this year. China needs to understand that trying to order us to clamp down on the rights of MPs to speak out, on our journalists and so on, are just inconsistent with our own values, just as it's wrong for China to suggest that we shouldn't be taking an interest in human rights issues. So we do need, I think, China to accept that for democracies like ours, we do come with different values, but that doesn't negate the fact that we do want a relationship which is strong and economically mutually beneficial.
And I guess the hardest part is when China still isn't answering the phone, answering those calls to try and mend this relationship. Let's talk about the reports in the Australian newspaper that 10 consulates in Shanghai have Communist Party members, and there's been a government-run recruitment agency that's placed advisors into Western embassies. Peter, what's your reaction to that?
Like with any form of interference into our politics, into our universities, our companies, we've seen hacking going on in all of those places for a number of years now. This is a very concerning report about, obviously, as you said, members of the Communist Party who have employment within consulates. The government should really explain what the implications are for the security of DFAT operations primarily, and what it's doing to eliminate those risks. As I understand it, there's very good, robust security vetting that goes on. But if these reports are true, obviously there's been some breaches in that, and there are some implications, and that needs to be explained. On the broader point, it is absolutely necessary for us and our national interest to ensure that any type of interference in our system, whether it be our DFAT operations, our embassies, our consulates, our universities, our corporate sector, our political, our parliament, that we are as robust as possible in ensuring that there are no interferences in those systems. That's in our national interest, and I would expect that the government will be working on this 24/7.
Yeah, as you said, it represents a broader issue. Trent, should we be concerned about it?
Well, I'd firstly say that obviously trying to reduce the potential for foreign interference and boosting Australia's cybersecurity capacity is something the government's been working on 24 hours a day. And we're obviously particularly sensitive to our missions, our embassies and consulates in countries where there's a track record of that type of interference, if I can put it that way. So I have no doubt that DFAT and our security agencies are very aware of the risks in a number of countries around the world. I don't have first-hand knowledge of of the allegations that were made today. But what I can also say, and this may be of interest to some of your viewers, because not many Australians get to go inside embassies in the way that Peter and I probably have. Employing locally engaged staff is often the majority of employees at our embassies and consulates, and it is important to recognise that locally engaged staff in any country, and obviously in countries where we have greater sensitivities even more so, are generally segregated in terms of the information that they're receiving and dealing with, but also often physically segregated. So most embassies and consulates will have secure areas where locally engaged staff may not be able to go, where you can't even, as a visiting MP, I found, even take your mobile phone into those areas. So DFAT does have arrangements in place to ensure that we can have a constructive relationship with locally engaged staff who more often than not do a fantastic job supporting Australia's interests, but at the same time, obviously ensure the security of our operations.
Oh, but is it the case, Trent, that maybe there needs to be a better vetting process then?
Well, I do think that DFAT has a very rigorous process before it engages locally engaged staff. I'm sure it's reviewing these allegations that have been printed today to see whether there's any lessons that need to be learned from it. But as I said before, obviously DFAT is very aware of both the opportunities and the risks of engaging local staff, and normally acts accordingly with some rigour.
Let's move on now to the climate situation and Scott Morrison's UN summit snub over the weekend. Peter, is it embarrassing that Australia wasn't invited to speak?
Yes, it's a diplomatic embarrassment, no doubt. I mean, Scott Morrison and this government has completely isolated themselves from action on climate change, and so isolated themselves, I suppose, from the international community and the direction it's taking. And quite frankly, it's embarrassing to see Australia left out of being included, I suppose, on the world stage in such an important conference. Look, the starting point for Scott Morrison, he needs to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. Like so many other countries in the world have, like pretty much every state and territory in Australia, 70% of our trading partners, that's your starting point. Commit to net zero. Major businesses have as well. And he needs to sort out his own party room and get it together, because otherwise Australia will continue to be left out. And that actually has an impact on our ability to engage at the international level, whether it's in respect to renewable energy, and frankly, losing our potential, the missed opportunity of the fact that Australia can be a renewable energy superpower. So we really can't afford to be excluded in this respect. And he should also probably formally announce that he's ditching the Kyoto credits, the carryovers, in calculating our emissions reductions on our targets. I don't think that's happened yet either. So there's a fair bit to catch.
Peter, the UN is calling for short-term and long-term goals from all nations. So what are Labor's short and long-term goals?
Well, our long-term goal has been announced. It's pretty clear-cut. Like I just said, we've committed to net zero emissions by 2050. With respect to shorter-term goals, we're working through all of that now, and the shadow ministers and the shadow cabinet will be working through all those calculations. It's a pretty complicated process, Danica, because, obviously you've got to work out, if we were to win government, when that happens, what the Morrison government hasn't done or has done up until that point. So there's a fair bit of work to be done around all of those goals. The key point, though, is a commitment to net zero emissions in 2050, and then we can actually start working and implementing the elements of the policy to get us there. And that's the commitment itself initially is the critical part of it.
And Trent, in terms of Scott Morrison snubbed now on the world stage, will this put more pressure now on Australia and the government to commit to net zero emissions?
Well, just to come back to the point you were raising with Peter, it is just extraordinary that Labor parties have ditched having 2030 targets, which is obviously what all countries are expected to have as part of the Paris Agreement, and that's clearly a reflection of the internal divisions in the Labor caucus, which we saw writ large by Joel Fitzgibbon's resignation from Shadow Cabinet. But on the broader issue, look, I think that we do have a very good story to tell, and the lineup on the weekend at that conference was a little bit curious, because you had countries like Finland and Israel and Singapore and Korea and China that all have increased their emissions over the same period in which we've significantly reduced ours. And I am pleased that the PM announced to that other multilateral forum, which is really important to us, the Pacific Islands Forum, that we will be getting to 2030 without having to rely on the Kyoto carryover credits. But what we are determined to do is make sure that every target that we set, we can actually match with action and can actually deliver. We've been doing that in relation to 2020. The projections last week show that we're going to potentially exceed it for 2030. And obviously, as we head to Glasgow next year, we'll be looking at what we take to that conference, making sure that they are realistic and deliverable. Because, as I think the UN Secretary General highlighted last week, what we don't want is a whole lot of countries making grandiose promises that they just simply don't deliver on.
Yeah, well, he also said he's calling on nations to declare a climate emergency. So I guess watch this space. Trent Zimmerman, Peter Khalil, all we have time for. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, exactly.